what I've seen just really in the last, very recent, certainly less than the last couple decades, is this, this conscious approach to really thinking about why you're removing that tree. So tree preservation on a much, much broader scale. In the past, we've talked about tree preservation when there are construction activities going on. Now it's a different story. And I think it's this general appreciation of, you know, bumper sticker on my truck says it takes 100 years to grow a 100-year-old tree. And people are starting to understand that more. I think people are starting to appreciate the fact that the average lifespan for an urban tree is somewhere around 30 to 35 years, which is terrible. Box elders live 4 or 5 times longer than that in a native environment. So that whole idea of preserving and respecting the aged trees is something that's becoming more and more common, and I love it, especially since I'm aged. I think people 2 decades ago appreciated the fact that trees had an economic value in terms of real estate value, but they didn't think of trees in an economic value of fewer people with upper respiratory issues, fewer people that were living in low-income housing with homes that had very poor insulation and no canopy cover, simply because it was a lower income neighborhood. Their quality of life was so much lower than it would have been if they would have had canopy.
People recognize, not just on the mental, intellectual level, but they see the street where all the trees just got cut down due to an insect or a disease, and they physically feel it. It's hot, it's punishingly bright and dusty and wind blowing down, and they recognize, like, yeah, I'm gonna walk down to the next block where there's trees, and they go, I can physically feel it. Climate change now, just realizing that this is a miraculous thing. Like, this is the outward reflection of the shape of our lungs, goes upward and outward, and it's built literally out of carbon and sunlight. And it gives off the oxygen that our lungs take in, that are the concave, inverse, downward branching reflection of the tree. So with climate change, recognizing this is all carbon, and it keeps pumping more carbon out of the atmosphere, the more of these we can keep going to bigger sizes, the better off we're going to be.
Well, I think you have to look at tree preservation in 2 ways. One is, if you have valued trees, and they could be valued because they have a historic value, or they could be a homeowner's tree. You know, it's like, I planted this when I moved in here, I planted this when my daughter and my son was born, etc. So that's one way of looking at tree preservation, is they have an emotional attachment. I want that tree to survive. Okay. The second is canopy preservation. So I'll talk about them briefly both ways. So we know what kills trees from construction activities. Root loss is number one. And root loss can be very gross, as you see tractors or ditch witches or equipment that are putting in new sidewalks, literally cutting off the roots. Root saws, chainsaws, whatever it is. They're cutting off the roots. And this is going to affect these trees, tree preservation, 1 of 2 ways. First of all of a sudden, this tree's capacity to take up water and nutrients has just been drastically removed. And we don't know how much it's been removed. Maybe it's been removed 20%, maybe it's been removed 80%, depending on how close they get to the tree. So that's one thing. Second thing is, it's less stable now. And if you can imagine, this tree now, instead of having a good stance that's making it a nice, stable, healthy tree for the landscape, it's perched on 1 foot for a while until those new roots. And the whole time it's perched in that 1 foot. Even in a relatively calm area like this, it doesn't take much for it to go over. So it becomes an unacceptable risk. Health-wise, it may have made it. It's no longer an acceptable risk. It has to be gone. So what are you going to do? Stop cutting the roots. That's it. And on a homeowner's property, it's very easy to do. Don't put the sidewalk there. Or if you need to have a sidewalk there, build it as a boardwalk. So you're just drilling in a few holes, putting in beams, putting in posts, and you can greatly minimize the root loss.
probably one of the biggest challenges that we're facing right now is how trees are being impacted by construction. You know, on campus, construction's happening all the time. In particular, in the compressed summer months, there's a lot of capital projects and things that have to happen. And so sometimes the design process will go so fast that we don't necessarily always have the opportunity to provide the comments that we really need to on behalf of the trees. And so it gets so far down the road where, you know, now, okay, we need to remove this manhole that's 2 feet away from the trunk of this, you know, 100-year-old ginkgo. It's like, okay, you know. And so being able to try to work with the contractors on being able to fulfill their job and their contract, but also doing our job in protecting the trees and the integrity of the campus is very challenging right now. And so I think being able to, again, use some of these technologies, you know, use tangible evidence to provide to the planners as to, no, this won't work, here's an alternative that is workable, is really critical, and that's something we're putting a big emphasis on right now.
I think there's a greater recognition of the value of the trees, especially the large, older trees. We were standing here not far from the birthplace of this institution. Back in 1851, when the university was started, literally a few hundred feet away from here, this area was primarily oak savanna. And a lot of those, if you look at some of the photographs from the early days of the university, say circa 1880, you can actually see some of the bur oaks in the photographs that remain here today. I think to underscore the institution's appreciation for these older trees, is a recent construction project in this area, in the knoll, which involved not only reconstruction of roads and potential realignment of roads, but also a lot of utility infrastructure, so a lot of digging and trenching. That was preceded by a joint effort to do a kind of a limited visual assessment of all the trees in the area, following which we assigned what we considered a relative value of the tree, and then we combined that with a GIS map showing approximate root zones for each tree. That combination of those data points really helped, I think, convey the potential impact that the project would have, but also allowed us to strategically route utilities and avoid some of the more valuable trees, some of the older trees, some of the more sensitive trees. And then that was combined with an effort during construction to carefully intercede, I guess, on behalf of certain trees with specific construction techniques, excavation techniques, things like air excavating around big roots, sometimes suspending roots over excavations, making careful cuts when cuts were needed. So that combination of planning and execution went a long way to preserving some very valuable trees. And I think that, to bring it on, bring it full circle, really underscores the institution's commitment to preserving these older trees.
My perspective on tree care has changed quite a bit since I've been on campus. There's a lot more people that are involved in the management of campus and have a larger interest in the trees, whether they're young trees, old trees, just trying to manage basically like an urban forest. The larger trees on campus are probably the most valuable trees we have. What's been challenging lately is but we're running into oak wilt, and two-line chestnut borer seems to be more prevalent. We're still battling Dutch elm disease, but the steps we're taking are improving and prolonging the life of these larger trees. We started vertical mulching, using the air spade, creating larger tree rings to try to keep the mowers and lawn pesticides and fertilizers as far away from these trees as we can. But the definitely more emphasis on disease and insect control and monitoring for that is starting to help. This silver maple behind me has been kind of an as-needed pruning basis over the last, 16 years since I've been here. And within the last 5 years, it's had several large branch failures. And we've basically just been kind of cleaning them up and dealing with it, not knowing what to do with this tree. And then this past winter, a lot of effort was put into pruning it, making a lot of reduction cuts, and trying to bring the crown in so it's not sprawling quite as much, and reduce weight on the branches, and get rid of any large deadwood. Silver maples, box elders, they're not exactly the most desirable trees. They are prone to a lot of storm damage, which is proof on this one here. But there are really not too many of them around, and it's nice to keep that diversity on campus. And this one here provides a lot of wildlife habitat. It's a lot of squirrels in it, for example. And to remove a tree this size, it provides a lot of shade. It's a very busy area. A lot of people hang out here. It'd be a great loss to lose it. So try to preserve it as long as we can.
Probably one of the most meaningful things that I've gone through in my career is the tree risk assessment qualification. I think it really makes you step back and look at all these different aspects of a tree, assess the condition, assess the surrounding landscape, do a target assessment. There's so many components that tell us what a risk rating is of a tree. And so a lot of people might see a large dead branch and, oh, this tree's got to come down. This tree's dangerous because it has a large branch that's dead. There's so much more to it. They see what's the risk of failure. Well, that's really just step one. To then take that and educate a person and say, even though this may have a high risk of failure, what's the likelihood that somebody or a target is going to be damaged, and what's the consequence that will come out of that damage? If a half-inch twig is falling down, that happens all the time, nothing happens. If a 6-inch branch falls in the middle of the night when no one's around, it's no problem. Most of those failures are going to happen during storm events or during situations where there's probably not people nearby the tree. Not always, but I think it's more likely that that's the case. And so being able to, again, kind of use an industry standard like TRAC and apply that to how you communicate to a customer or how you communicate to really your crew or really anybody, to help everyone understand what the approach is going to be for that tree, why, and how we're going to see that the management of that tree in the future. So that's been a really important part of the last several years.
Where there's a large tree, questionable status about its structure, proximity to targets, all those kind of things, what really is a great tool to rely on is the ISA risk assessment form, because they account for everything about a tree and its surroundings. And if you go through that line by line with the client on hand, then they're walking through the process with you, and they see that it's a systematic way to reach some kind of a conclusion about the tree. And then it's not just like you walked in there and said, oh yeah, I think you should remove it. Well, why? Because it just looks scary. It makes all these kind of nebulous judgment calls backed up with a systematic process and a documentation. So, diameter tape, that's good to know, because for the starting point of your risk assessment mathematics, you got to know the diameter of the tree to do calculations on how much sound wood relative to decayed wood is inside that stem. So that's a good thing to have in your kit.
I am not track certified, but I've used the form or the ISA form to, on a valuable tree where the tree's kind of in question, just to help lay out my observations for the tree manager, the property owner, just to show them my unbiased opinion on what the condition of the tree is.
Yeah, I think if, I'm going to ask you the same question. If you would have seen me in the early days, I used a mallet, but more often I used a Louisville Slugger baseball bat. And so I would tap and I would sound the trees to get an idea of where there may be decay, and maybe kind of get a little bit of an idea if it's really bad or if it's just a little pocket. Versus somebody coming out with a resistograph or a tomograph, setting it all up, getting readings from that, visual readings as well as mathematical readings. Who would you have more confidence in? I would have more confidence in somebody that has the technology and actually knows how to use it.
I could start with the rubber mallet. Really simple tool to do what I call the thump test. The thump test is the starting point for anything from a pre-climb inspection to a risk assessment to a diagnostic for health conditions of the tree. And you just thump around the base of the tree, listen for hollow pockets or even mushy patches of bark. You quickly can tell what feels solid and what kind of sounds unresponsive or weird, mushy. And if you're lacking the rubber mallet, there's always the back end of a knife handle. All right, so as I was saying, I start every diagnostic visit or risk assessment or even a pre-climb inspection with a thump test, either with a mallet or just the back end of a knife handle. If you don't have a mallet, you can just go. But since I've got a good mallet, I'll use that in this case. So I'm just going around trying to find places where it sounds mushy or hollow or dead. Here you can see an obvious place where we're down to bare wood. There, that seems a little bit weird, so I kind of peek underneath it. But we're still at sound wood. So far everything seems pretty decent.
Yeah, so I just have a basic mallet that has a harder plastic end and a little bit softer rubber end, and I just use that to tap on the tree to sound it out to see if I can notice any hollow spots or different sounds in the tree, and I work my way around the tree. If I see evidence of something going on with the tree, a crack or a different formation in the growth, kind of tapping a little bit more diligently around that area to try and find a different sound, just to get a basic understanding of if there's anything going on in the tree, to see if we need to do a further inspection. So first I typically walk around the tree, look for any deformations in the trunk or cracks or anything like that. And then I'll sound the tree. This tree is pretty free of defects sounding, a basic quick sounding. I don't hear any different noises indicate if there's any decay going on in there.
And then DeWalt cordless drill with a 12-inch, 1/8 inch diameter bit, and it's got an earplug on it. Just really the low-cost version if you don't want to spend the pile of money on an actual resistograph. You can drill into a tree and back it out. The earplug kind of becomes a depth gauge as to where you're drilling in, backing out, and you determine where's white, clean wood coming out, where it changes to brown, crumbly stuff. And with a 12-inch bit, you can actually get to the level of, like behind me is a 53-inch diameter tree. And for a 53-inch diameter tree, the ratio we're supposed to have for every 6-inch diameter, 1 inch of sound wood. So for a 53-inch diameter tree, it works out to just under 9 inches, something like that. So we've got plenty of room on a 12-inch bit to determine if we've got 9 inches of good, clean wood in there. So really basic tools. You don't have to have a lot of fancy stuff. Like this whole kit I just showed you, you could get for a couple $100. So super basic.
One big project that we've been working on, or collaborative effort that we've been working on, is on some of these tree preservation efforts with retrenchment pruning, resistance drilling to monitor decay levels in the inside of a tree. And so trying to get a better sense of, seeing really what is happening on the inside of that tree. You can't see everything from the outside. So using technologies like the resistograph or the sonic tomography to give you a better idea of really what's happening on the inside of that tree, being able to make a three-dimensional visual of that tree can help guide decisions for management later. Where to make pruning cuts, where to keep an eye out for decay columns to extend, things of that nature. So the collaboration that we've had with your team has been critical. We have hard evidence, something science-based that we can then bring to stakeholders, bring to landscape architects who are on these capital projects. That's really going to help tell the story of why these trees might be important, or what trees might be really worth protecting or might not be worth protecting. And so using those technologies to help guide decisions and also to help people understand a little more tangibly what's happening is really important. I think everyone can look at a tree and appreciate its architecture, its nice full canopy, but even a tree that looks or appears healthy could have a lot of significant defects and something that should be addressed. And so to be able to explain that to a customer and say, well, what's wrong with this tree? It looks perfectly healthy. Well, these tangible things are wrong. And so being able to use those technologies to communicate that can be really important.
We know that reduction pruning is a part of tree preservation, of that conservation arboriculture method really described by Neville Fay. How do we measure it? How do we measure the tree's response to it? And how do we measure that dose? Okay, so we can collect data when we're pruning, diameter, size of the branch pruned and the branches left. But what's really come into play over the last 6 to 8 months in our research has been using LiDAR technology. So using terrestrial LiDAR systems on the ground, we can scan our trees before pruning and then after pruning to assess how those openings in the canopy are being filled in. So as you remember, Brian really described how these trees reiterate, how we lose part of the tree due to natural aging, natural maturing. The tree then puts out a branch to take that space, to fill that space. It's part of how trees respond. So then we can examine how our pruning dose and our pruning placement in the perspective of LiDAR has allowed that tree to regenerate new canopy in areas that we want to regenerate. A lot of canopy researchers, Steve Sillett, Anthony Ambrose, they're still manually measuring trees, which is awesome. I think they're creating these manual maps of coastal redwoods. It takes a lot of time. Those trees have a very high intrinsic individual value. To really accelerate the pace at which we're able to conduct this research, LiDAR really allows us to move along at a much faster pace, as fast as a laser. In many cases, when you see trees that are compromised due to failure, it's not a total failure at the main stem. We'll see partial failure of part of the canopy. And in the case of black walnut, during really heavy fruiting years, we can see really heavy loads of fruit on this tree that can really weigh down this canopy. And I think that if we were to lose a significant portion of this canopy, that would just accelerate this tree's path to an untimely death or removal. So if we can assess the upper part of the canopy more accurately, then we can make decisions that help maintain the tree on a holistic level, rather than just having this sort of laser focus just on that main stem or main trunk. And a good example would be, I spent many years working with young American elm trees, finding ways to maintain them, to develop good structure. And in cases of where we see catastrophic failure of young Princeton American elm or Valley Forge American elm, the tree doesn't break at the main stem. We have a large tear out or a large break due to branch inclusion that requires that tree to be removed because it's so compromised, it's so destroyed from that canopy loss, it has to be removed. So what we want to avoid in these large trees is that large limb failure that might again accelerate that loss of tree to a much earlier date and time. So we've identified some signs. Okay, we don't really have any symptoms of decline. Again, the tree looks healthy, but there is a sign here that indicates that, yeah, maybe we want to be concerned about it. So then now the question is we know we have an area we're concerned about. What can we do? One option would be to approach that in a reduction pruning capacity. So we can make a diffuse pruning dose applied throughout that section of the canopy, making small cuts to minimize the intrusion of future decay, thus reducing the weight or loading on that branch.
So reduction pruning isn't necessarily a reduction cut. In my world, a reduction prune is the idea of reducing the overall extent and thickness of a canopy. So what that would mean is, like, say my hand is the tree, the full crown edge, right, with full leaf on. My idea of reduction pruning, or the basic bare minimum entry-level idea, is that we're going to reduce the outer edge of the crown. And so it'll eventually be just a little bit smaller. If you go on from something this big to something this big, you've gone way too hard on that tree. And so that's kind of how I start with the idea, is I'm thinking generally in this tree, a tree like we're in now, a big walnut that's wide, super wide. This tree is at least as wide as it is tall, maybe wider. So in that case, I'm thinking about, well, this tree sure is wide, but not that tall, so maybe my reduction cuts will focus on the edges, the sides, and bringing the sides in, and not so much on shrinking the top down, because we're not worried about this tree getting taller. If it gets wider, the longer that lever gets, the forces increase exponentially. So if I got a 10-foot lever and I got a 1-pound branch on the end, that's 10,000 pounds. I cut that off, I just saved 10,000 pounds of loading on the union, right? But now say this limb is like one of these low ones below me here, where the limb's 40 or 50 feet long, and there's just brush on the very end. So if I go out there and take a pound off on a 40-foot limb, that's 4,000 pounds of loading that I just took off from the union. So the idea then is to take enough material to lessen the load, but not too much material to drastically alter the tree.
We're all becoming better biologists, tree physiologists, mechanical engineers, and that interest and that awareness is what's helping us become better. But every tool we're using today, 10 years from now, we're going to be laughing about it. It's going to go, can you believe we were using a resistograph or the tomograph? I still think it's going to get to the point within my lifetime, like taking temperatures of people, that you can just hold up a beacon to their foreheads. We're going to do the same thing with trees. And that's going to give us an idea, a much better idea of, is this tree an acceptable risk? Is it worth preserving? Or, there's something wrong in there. Something's not moving correctly. Is it native to North America? I go, that's a great approach. But I think when you look at the palette of trees, what is the percentage of urban forest now that are American elms? Well, it's less than 5%, considerably less than 5%. Ash trees are just plummeting down. If Asian longhorn beetle reaches this part of the country, we could lose all or most of our maples. So incrementally, we keep losing these kind of favored species, which really should get us thinking about, stop thinking about certain species, start thinking about what's going to survive and contribute to the canopy. So, things like box elder. I said that I gave a flippant answer to how long they may live compared to an average residential tree. Nobody knows how long box elders live because they never really die. They just keep sprouting back, etc. Yeah, they're not a beautiful tree, but I've seen box elders that have been carefully maintained. They're really nice looking trees. And they're junkyard dogs. They can survive so much. Male cottonwoods. I understand people not liking female cottonwoods with all the seed and cotton fluff, but you get away with that with male cottonwoods. I mean, they're native, they're very, very site tough, they grow fast, they get up in the canopy quickly. Hackberries, honey locusts, just, if we could get to a situation where no one species represented more than 2, 3, 4, or 5% of a community's canopy, that'd be a healthy plant.
I definitely see a lot more people planting trees and a more diversity of trees. You still get your people that want the maples, but they're more aware of what else is out there, and with emerald ash borer coming through, they're aware of losing all the ash trees just like we lost all the elm trees, and they're open to planting other species of trees, and they want to, people with older mature trees, they realize that their trees are older and they want to be able to plant new trees to help those come up in afterwards, so when they do eventually have to take a tree down, there'll be something there to replace it.
One of the things that we've done over the last several years is we've tried to introduce more biodiversity. It became clear that we really needed to look at that in with the arrival of emerald ash borer. What we saw at that time is we had a predominance of Fraxinus across the campus. That was our primary genus. I think it represented about 14% of the campus canopy. And what's interesting about that is the ash were planted in response to Dutch elm disease. So we kind of repeated the same error that we made long ago by planting a lot of elm trees. So we've tried to introduce quite a bit more biodiversity. The manager of our tree program, Elliott, Redmann, and his crew have been instrumental in that, as well as our landscape architects who have helped us ensure that we are diversifying the campus.
Large trees die, or when emerald ash borer comes in and we know that we're going to lose a certain percentage of trees, you have to really take a long, hard look at where those are. And I think there's a natural tendency to say, oh, we took that tree out, let's put a tree right back in that same spot and right on the same stump. And everyone's used to seeing that tree, they've grown attached to it. Not only students, but there are plenty of staff who work at the university every day, and they might have their office window right outside this tree that they've used or viewed forever. And so again, there's kind of a natural tendency to just replace what was gone. And I try to resist that temptation, and sometimes that might be the solution, that might be the right decision. But other times you have to take it as an opportunity to look at the surrounding landscape and determine, is this a good place for a tree? Tom had mentioned about the donation of buckeyes that we had. Just because we have a tree doesn't mean it has to go right there. I love trees as much as the next person, but they have an element, they provide an element in the landscape, and not every square inch needs to be covered with a tree. And so you have to kind of think long and hard about placement of those, and where trees naturally want to be and where that fits in with the existing landscape.
We're putting a larger emphasis, especially in the winter time, for pruning and developing these smaller trees so we can develop them into a nice mature tree and not end up with large branch failure like we're still running into, and trying to get a good natural form to set the tree up for a good future, for hopefully don't have mechanical failures in the future. For the last, especially probably 10 years here at the U, we put a big emphasis on formative pruning of these younger trees to set them up for a bright future.
I think it depends. You never know. You put your word out there authentically and honestly, and whoever is there receptive to it will pick up on it. And you might not know it right away from their response or reaction, but years later, somebody maybe contacts you and says, yeah, I remember when we talked about this and that's what I did and here's my results. And you get pleasantly surprised enough times. And yeah, I think the whole young tree kind of thing, those conversations are relatively easy to have if you kind of set a context like, you know, this individual tree is not going to be around forever. And we can do what we can to extend its life, hopefully, but you have to start making room for the new recruits to fill in the ranks. And we can't just rely on an even-aged cohort of all the same trees of all the same species. And people get that now with, there was Dutch elm disease, now there's emerald ash borer, and it's finally getting to be more of that policy of diverse plantings, all those kind of things. You can see it around, and the general public, I think, gets that.
Like over the last several years, we've put a big emphasis on tree pruning, developmental pruning in particular. There's so many young trees on campus, and they really require a lot more maintenance, more frequent maintenance than some of the older trees. And so we really have to rely very heavily on the expertise of our staff and try to balance all the different tree tasks that you have. You know, tree pruning is just one small section of a maintenance program, and so to try to balance all the things that need to go into managing a healthy campus is really challenging, in particular when you have a campus the size that we do, roughly 10,000 trees on campus, and you know, you could look at any individual tree and it probably could use some form of work at any given time. So you really have to kind of be selective and to pick and choose what's most important at that time. And as we know too, so many pest issues are very timing critical, and so you know, if you miss a window, you have to kind of make decisions there. Do you roll the dice and hope something works, or do you kind of just skip it for that season? So there's a lot of moving parts all the time, and of course labor resources are always a challenge. Just relying on the staff that we have and trying to recruit students to work on the crew are all things that are challenges that we have to deal with.
It's going to be important for us all in the long haul, you know, keeping these trees around. I mean, if you want humanity to stay on the planet and to live healthy, full lives, we need trees. Like without trees, the climate doesn't work. Like the trees are, I don't know, I'm not a climate scientist, so I don't want to say how big of a component they play in Earth having like livable temperatures. But you know, me as a tree guy, trees are the most important thing I can think of to influence not just my children's lives, but their children's lives into the future. Because without trees, we're done. I mean, bye-bye, whole Central America is going to wash away. Not Central America as in like this, you know, North America, South America, Central America, but like Central America as like the Mississippi Valley is just going to disappear into the Gulf of Mexico without the trees here to stabilize all our soil and to reduce the wind and the storms and stuff. And so these are very, very important things. And there's diseases and insects that are threatening almost every single one. And they're distributed everywhere. And so the sooner we figure out how to really manage these trees, the better for everybody forever. And I think that's scary, but also a fun challenge. We really need to take our trees seriously, and thank goodness for this research to help us do that.
It can be very overwhelming trying to keep an eye on over 10,000 trees on this campus. I guess words of wisdom is, I don't know, just look up. I mean, too many people are walking around not paying attention to anything around them, especially the trees. It's just look up and you know, enjoy what we have here on campus, because a lot of these trees will still be here when we're all long gone.
The recommendation has kind of always been try different experiences. You know, when you're going to college, do a different type of internship every summer. Try private, try public in the industry, and also keep an open mind. Always learn stuff. I've been doing it for 15 years, which I don't feel is that long, but I'm always learning new things, and I know I don't know everything, and just keeping an open mind like that.
Oh, for the next generation, I want to see them go out there and go way beyond us and think of a timeline of trees have been on Earth for 385 million years, and Homo sapiens has been on Earth for 350,000 years, and we've been urbanized creatures for maybe 7,000 years, and we've had some discipline called arboriculture, maybe generously speaking, for about 100 years. So 100 years relative to 385 million years on a timeline, that's like, here's 100 years at, 1 year is a centimeter, and the length of time trees have been here is a timeline from here to Guatemala City, from Minneapolis to Guatemala City. So approach your arboriculture with that humility in mind, that we haven't even begun to understand the first thing about trees, but that's a whole part of the world to be inspired by and go after. That's what I want to give the next generation.
I think sometimes, and again, kind of building on the theme of good intentions, but sometimes have unintended consequences. Several years ago, back right when I started working here, there was a donation of 30 buckeye trees. They're nice trees, but there was a lot of pressure to find places to plant the trees, and as a result we have this preponderance of buckeye trees all over campus. And what we're finding today is that they were, in some cases, kind of shoehorned into spaces where they didn't really fit and really don't fit now. And we're faced with a really difficult management decision now, because those are memorial trees. How do we, it's difficult to remove a memorial tree. And so I guess I would just suggest that it's great to plant trees, but really look to the future when you do it, and think about the impact that your decision will have.
Well, there's two. One of them is kind of general. When you're working with homeowners in particular, it doesn't matter if it's a boulevard tree, which is the city's tree, or if it's a tree in their front yard and they're putting new sidewalks in. No one likes to say goodbye. No one likes to say goodbye, and especially they don't like to say goodbye to a friend. And they look at these trees as kind of emotional friends. That sounds a little cheesy, but it's the truth. They look, it's like, that's my tree. So actually it's a boulevard tree, it's not your, no, it's my tree. This is my tree. So getting across to them that the activities that are going to happen here, they kind of have to happen. You have to have new infrastructure in here. The sidewalks have been so compromised that they're dangerous. This has to be fixed. And when that happens, there's going to be so much structural damage to your friend that it's too dangerous to leave them standing there. That's probably the most common situation I've been in. The other situation, without naming the city or the location, it would be people giving up too soon and not taking in consideration, like, this is a bur oak. Bur oaks are some of the toughest trees we have in terms of tolerating construction damage or developmental changes. give this thing every shot you can, and use growth regulators to slow down the above ground growth that allows the root system to catch up to a more balanced system. So those, that's kind of an isolated one. Saying goodbye to friends, that's all the time. Yeah, that's a tough one, because they're looking at this tree, it looks beautiful, and now you're telling me that it's dangerous, too dangerous.